before the world knew his name, before the headlines, before the billions and the global influence. Jack Ma was a boy growing up in a modest home in Hangzhou, China, in circumstances that gave no indication of what his future might become. There were no signs of privilege around him. No powerful family connections. No early brilliance that made teachers take notice. His beginnings were quiet, ordinary, and constrained by the realities of his environment. Jack Ma was born in 1964, at a time when China was still largely closed off from the global economy. Opportunities were limited, and for many families, life followed a predictable path shaped by necessity rather than ambition. His parents worked as traditional performers, earning just enough to sustain the household. Wealth was not part of the conversation. Security was never guaranteed. As a child, Jack Ma struggled in school. Academic success did not come easily to him. In a system that valued test performance and conformity, he often found himself falling behind. Teachers did not describe him as gifted. Classmates did not see him as exceptional. In many ways, he blended into the background, another student trying to navigate expectations. That felt heavy and unforgiving, but there was one quiet difference that would later matter more than anyone realized. Jack Ma was curious about the world beyond his immediate surroundings. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Hangzhou began to see an increasing number of foreign tourists. For many locals, these visitors were distant figures, passing through without interaction. For Jack Ma, they represented something else entirely, a connection to a wider world that felt otherwise unreachable. Every morning, before school, he would ride his bicycle for long distances to areas where tourists gathered. He did not go there to sell anything. He did not go there to ask for favors. He went with a single purpose: to practice English. At a time when resources were scarce and formal English education was limited, Jack Ma chose to learn by listening. He spoke with tourists. He asked simple questions. He made mistakes, often many of them, but he returned every day, persistent, patient, and unembarrassed by imperfection. This routine continued for years, while others slept or followed familiar patterns. Jack Ma invested his mornings in something that had no immediate reward. There was no certificate, no guarantee, only the slow accumulation of understanding, shaped by repetition and curiosity. It was not ambition in the traditional sense. It was exposure. Through these conversations, he began to understand not just a new language, but new ways of thinking. He heard stories about countries he had never seen. He learned how people from different cultures approached work, failure, and possibility. This quiet education, happening outside classrooms and without recognition, would later become one of his greatest assets, but at the time, it did not translate into success. When the time came to take the National College entrance examination, Jack Ma failed, not once, not twice, but multiple times. In a society where academic achievement strongly influenced one's future, these failures were significant setbacks. Each attempt required preparation, hope, and endurance. Each failure reinforced a growing narrative that perhaps he was not meant for more. Eventually, after repeated attempts, Jack Ma was admitted to Hangzhou Teachers Institute, a modest institution that trained educators. It was not an elite university. It did not carry prestige, but it offered him a path forward. He studied English and later graduated, becoming an English teacher. The job was stable but modest. His salary was low, and the prospects for advancement were limited. Teaching provided structure but not transformation. Still, Jack Ma approached the role with seriousness. He enjoyed communication. He valued the act of explaining ideas. He learned how to hold attention, how to simplify complex concepts, and how to speak with clarity. These skills, too, went largely unnoticed at the time. As China began to open more visibly to the world in the early 1990s, new opportunities appeared, but not evenly. For many, the promise of change was accompanied by competition, uncertainty, and rejection. Jack Ma began applying for jobs outside teaching. He was rejected again and again. He applied to hotels, to companies, to offices that were hiring for entry-level positions. In one widely remembered moment, he applied to work at a local fast food restaurant when it opened in his city. Out of many applicants, nearly all were accepted, except him. He was the only one turned away. These experiences were not dramatic in isolation. Many people face rejection. What made them significant was their accumulation. Each refusal reinforced a pattern that had followed Jack Ma since childhood: effort without reward, persistence without recognition, and yet he did not withdraw. In 1995, Jack Ma traveled to the United States for the first time. It was during this visit that he encountered something entirely new to him: the internet. At that time, the internet was still in its early stages. For many people, it was confusing, abstract, and difficult to imagine as something practical. But Jack Ma noticed something immediately. When he searched online for information about China, there was very little available. Businesses were not represented. Products were not listed. Opportunities were invisible. This absence sparked a realization: if China's companies were not visible online, they were effectively invisible to the world. And if the internet was going to grow, as he sensed it would, then this invisibility would become a disadvantage. He did not understand the technical side of the internet. He could not code. He did not come from a technology background. What he had was perspective shaped by years of observing the gap between China and the global market. This insight marked a turning point: returning to China. Jack Ma attempted his first internet-related venture. It failed. The idea did not take hold. The market was not ready. Resources were limited. Support was scarce, but the experience taught him something essential. Technology was not about tools alone. It was about connection. In 1999, Jack Ma gathered a small group of friends in his apartment in Hangzhou. There were no offices, no polished presentations, no external investors, just a shared belief that small and medium-sized businesses in China needed a way to connect with buyers beyond their immediate reach. This belief became Alibaba. In its earliest days, Alibaba was not impressive by conventional standards. The company lacked capital. Infrastructure was weak. Internet access was unreliable. Many people doubted whether such a platform could work in China at all, but Jack Ma focused on people, not systems. He believed that technology should serve ordinary users, not experts. That platforms should be accessible, not intimidating. That trust mattered more than efficiency in the beginning. While competitors focused on rapid expansion or technical superiority, Jack Ma emphasized relationships. He spoke constantly about culture, values, and long-term thinking, concepts that seemed abstract in an environment driven by speed and profit. Progress was slow. There were moments when the company nearly collapsed. Funding ran low. Competitors grew faster. External pressure increased, but Jack Ma had spent his life navigating uncertainty. Compared to years of rejection, these challenges felt familiar. He continued. Over time, Alibaba began to grow. Small businesses adopted the platform. Trust increased. The network effect strengthened. What started in a small apartment gradually expanded into something much larger, and still, Jack Ma remained an unconventional leader. He did not position himself as a technical visionary. He spoke openly about his limitations. He framed his role as someone who understood people rather than machines. This perspective shaped Alibaba's identity as it expanded, not just as a marketplace, but as an ecosystem designed to support millions of entrepreneurs who, like Jack Ma himself, started with very little. As Alibaba grew, so did its influence within China and eventually beyond it, but the foundation of that growth was not built on sudden breakthroughs or exceptional genius. It was built on years of persistence, quiet preparation, and the ability to see value where others saw absence. Jack Ma's story, up to this point, is not about success. It is about endurance. It is about remaining open when circumstances repeatedly suggest closing off. It is about learning without guarantees. And it is only the beginning. Jack Ma, Rise from Nothing Full Biography, Part 2 of 5 as Alibaba began to take shape. Jack Ma found himself leading a company in an environment that was still uncertain, unpredictable, and often hostile to new ideas. China's digital infrastructure was improving, but it was far from mature. Trust in online transactions was low. Many businesses preferred face-to-face dealings, paper contracts, and established relationships for Alibaba to survive. It had to solve a deeper problem than technology. It had to solve trust. Jack Ma understood this instinctively. Years of rejection had taught him that people rarely resist ideas, they resist uncertainty. If Alibaba was going to succeed, it needed to make ordinary people feel safe participating in a system they did not yet understand. Instead of rushing to scale, Jack Ma focused on building confidence. He encouraged sellers to tell their stories. He emphasized transparency. He insisted that the platform serve small businesses first rather than chasing large corporations that already had resources. This approach was unconventional. Many investors at the time believed success depended on aggressive growth and rapid monetization. Jack Ma believed success depended on patience. Money, he often said, would follow trust. During these early years, Alibaba struggled financially. The company burned through capital quickly and revenue was uncertain. There were periods when salaries were delayed. Employees worked long hours with little assurance that their efforts would pay off. What kept them there was not compensation. It was belief. Jack Ma was not known for offering detailed technical roadmaps. Instead, he spoke about purpose. He talked about the future of small businesses. He reminded his team that most companies in China were not large enterprises, but small operations run by ordinary people trying to survive. He framed Alibaba not as a company, but as a mission. This sense of mission became especially important as competition intensified. In the early 2000s, global technology companies began to take interest in the Chinese market. Among them was eBay, a dominant force in online marketplaces worldwide. With vast resources, global experience, and brand recognition, eBay appeared to be an unstoppable competitor. Many assumed Alibaba would not survive. eBay entered China aggressively, acquiring local platforms and investing heavily in infrastructure. From a purely financial and technical perspective, Alibaba was outmatched. Observers expected Jack Ma's company to be absorbed or pushed aside. Jack Ma responded not by copying eBay's strategy, but by leaning further into his own. He believed that understanding local behavior mattered more than importing global models. Chinese consumers, he argued, had different expectations. They valued communication, negotiation, and personal interaction. A rigid, standardized platform would feel distant. Alibaba adapted accordingly. Features were designed to encourage dialogue between buyers and sellers. Customer support was localized. The platform evolved in response to real usage patterns rather than theoretical efficiency. One of the most important developments during this period was the creation of Alipay. Online payments were a major barrier to growth. Many users did not trust digital transactions. Fear of fraud was widespread. Without a reliable payment system, e-commerce could not scale. Alipay addressed this by acting as an intermediary. Payments were held until buyers confirmed satisfaction. This escrow-like system reduced risk and increased confidence. Again, the solution was not purely technical. It was psychological. Trust was designed into the process. This focus allowed Alibaba not only to survive competition from eBay, but eventually to surpass it within China. While eBay struggled to adapt, Alibaba grew steadily, supported by users who felt understood rather than processed. For Jack Ma, this period reinforced a core belief. Technology succeeds when it aligns with human behavior. As Alibaba expanded, so did its complexity. New platforms emerged within the ecosystem, each serving different functions: wholesale trade, consumer retail, payments, logistics, and cloud services. Managing this growth required a shift in leadership. Jack Ma was no longer leading a small team in an apartment. He was guiding an organization with thousands of employees and millions of users. Decisions carried greater consequences. Visibility increased. Expectations multiplied, and yet Jack Ma resisted the idea of becoming a conventional corporate leader. He spoke openly about his limitations. He reminded audiences that he was not an engineer. He described himself as a former teacher who learned by listening. Rather than presenting certainty, he emphasized adaptability. This humility became part of Alibaba's public identity. Internally, Jack Ma focused on culture. He believed that values mattered more than strategy because strategy could change. But values guided decisions when conditions were unclear. He encouraged employees to think long-term, even when short-term pressures were intense. He talked about serving society, not just shareholders. These ideas were sometimes criticized as vague or idealistic, but they provided coherence during periods of rapid change. As Alibaba's influence grew, it began to attract significant international attention. Investors from outside China saw the company as a gateway to the world's largest population of consumers. Partnerships formed. Capital flowed in, expectations rose, with attention came scrutiny. Jack Ma became a public figure, representing not just a company but a model of Chinese entrepreneurship that differed from state-driven narratives. He spoke frequently at conferences, sharing his perspective on leadership, failure, and innovation. Despite his rising profile, he continued to emphasize his early struggles. He reminded audiences that success was not linear, that rejection, uncertainty, and doubt were not exceptions, but constants. He spoke not as someone who had mastered the future, but as someone who had learned to live with unpredictability. As Alibaba approached the next stage of its evolution, the stakes grew higher. Expansion beyond China required new strategies. Regulatory environments differed. Cultural assumptions shifted. What worked domestically would not always translate globally. Jack Ma faced a new challenge: how to maintain the company's original values while operating on a global scale. This challenge would define the next chapter of Alibaba's journey and test whether the principles that guided its rise could withstand the pressures of global influence. For Jack Ma, the question was no longer whether he could build a company. It was whether he could guide it through complexity without losing its foundation. And this question would soon bring him face to face with forces far larger than competition or market uncertainty. End of Part 2. Default text: Jack Ma, Rise from Nothing, Full Biography, Part 3 of 5. As Alibaba moved deeper into global markets, Jack Ma's role continued to evolve. What began as a mission to support small Chinese businesses had grown into a complex international enterprise. With this growth came new forms of pressure, not only from competitors but from expectations, regulations, and public perception. Alibaba was no longer an underdog, it was becoming a symbol. For many observers, Jack Ma represented a new kind of entrepreneur, one who emerged from modest circumstances and navigated a rapidly changing society with adaptability rather than dominance. This image carried both opportunity and risk. With greater visibility came greater responsibility.
Jack Ma understood that scale changes everything. Decisions that once affected a few hundred users now affected millions. A single statement could influence markets. A single misstep could invite scrutiny from authorities, partners, and the public. Rather than centralizing control, Jack Ma focused on delegation. He believed that leadership was not about commanding outcomes, but about preparing others to make decisions. He encouraged teams to operate independently, guided by shared principles rather than rigid instructions. This approach reflected his background as a teacher. Teachers do not control learning. They create conditions for it. Alibaba's ecosystem continued to expand. Platforms like Taobao and Tmall reshaped consumer behavior within China. Online shopping became normalized. Digital payments became routine. Small businesses gained access to markets that were previously unreachable. The company's influence extended beyond commerce. It affected logistics, finance, advertising, and cloud computing. Each expansion brought new challenges: technical, ethical, and regulatory. Jack Ma often spoke about balance. He warned against confusing growth with progress. He emphasized that companies should measure success not only by revenue, but by impact. These ideas resonated with some and frustrated others. Critics argued that Alibaba's scale created new forms of inequality. Supporters pointed to the millions of small businesses that benefited from access to digital tools. The truth, as with most large systems, was complex. Jack Ma did not claim certainty. He acknowledged that innovation creates consequences, some intended, others not. His focus remained on adaptability, the ability to observe, adjust, and respond without clinging to fixed assumptions. As Alibaba prepared for its public listing, the stakes reached a new level. In 2014, Alibaba launched its initial public offering in New York. The event drew global attention. It became one of the largest IPOs in history, signaling Alibaba's arrival as a major global player. For Jack Ma, the moment was both symbolic and sobering. The public listing marked the culmination of years of persistence. It also marked the beginning of a new phase, where accountability extended beyond internal culture to shareholders, regulators, and global audiences. He spoke during this period about responsibility. He reminded investors that Alibaba was not built to deliver short-term returns alone, but to endure over decades. He emphasized sustainability over speed. This message was not always welcomed in markets, accustomed to rapid growth narratives, but it reflected Jack Ma's long-term orientation, shaped by a life in which progress had always been slow and uncertain. As Alibaba's valuation soared, Jack Ma's personal wealth increased dramatically. Headlines focused on numbers. Rankings listed him among the world's richest individuals. Yet he appeared increasingly uncomfortable with the spotlight. He reiterated that wealth was a byproduct, not a goal. He described money as a responsibility rather than a measure of worth. He spoke about education, opportunity, and the importance of preparing future generations for a world defined by change. His public persona remained unconventional. He avoided corporate jargon. He used simple language. He shared stories rather than statistics. He framed challenges as questions rather than conclusions. This approach humanized him, but it also exposed him to criticism. In moments when his statements conflicted with prevailing expectations, particularly regarding regulation, finance, and governance, responses were swift. In an environment where words carried increasing weight, even casual remarks could be interpreted as positions. Jack Ma was learning, once again, that influence changes the rules. The freedom he enjoyed as an outsider did not fully translate to the role of a public figure. Leading a massive institution, visibility invited oversight, independence invited negotiation. At the same time, Alibaba's internal structure was changing. Leadership transitions were planned. Responsibilities were redistributed. Jack Ma spoke openly about the importance of succession. He believed that founders should not remain indefinitely, that organizations needed renewal to remain healthy. This belief was shaped by his understanding of impermanence. Nothing, he often suggested, should depend on a single individual. In 2019, Jack Ma stepped down as executive chairman of Alibaba. The decision was not abrupt. It followed years of preparation, signaling his intention to transition from operational leadership to a more advisory role. For some, the move was surprising. For others, it was consistent with his philosophy. He framed the transition not as a departure, but as a continuation, a shift in focus from management to mentorship. Education, long a central theme in his thinking, became a primary area of engagement. He invested time and resources into initiatives aimed at supporting teachers, students, and young entrepreneurs. This return to education felt deliberate. Teaching had been his first profession. Communication had been his early strength. In stepping away from corporate leadership, he was not abandoning his identity. He was reconnecting with it. Yet even as he moved into this new phase, the environment around him continued to evolve. Global attitudes toward technology companies were shifting. Regulation increased. Public expectations changed. The relationship between private enterprise and governance became more complex. Jack Ma's journey, which had been shaped by adaptability, now required restraint. Influence demanded caution. Silence, at times, became more powerful than speech. For someone whose life had been defined by communication, by speaking, teaching, persuading, this was a profound adjustment. But adaptation had always been his response to change, from a child learning English through daily conversations, to an entrepreneur building trust in unfamiliar systems, to a leader navigating global complexity. Jack Ma's path had never been linear. It had been responsive, and as the next chapter unfolded, that responsiveness would be tested in ways he could not fully control. Jack Ma, Rise from Nothing, Full Biography, Part 5. After stepping down from his executive role, Jack Ma entered a period of life that appeared quieter on the surface, but was no less complex beneath it. The transition marked a shift not only in responsibility, but in visibility. For the first time in decades, he was no longer at the center of daily corporate decision-making. This absence was intentional. Jack Ma had long spoken about the importance of knowing when to step away. He believed that holding on to power for too long weakens both leaders and institutions. True leadership, in his view, involved preparing others to continue without dependence. Yet stepping back did not mean disengaging. His attention turned increasingly toward education. He spoke about the need to prepare young people for a future defined not by stability, but by constant change. Automation, artificial intelligence, and globalization were reshaping labor markets faster than traditional systems could adapt. Jack Ma argued that education systems needed to evolve, not by producing more specialists, but by nurturing creativity, empathy, and resilience. These ideas reflected his own experience. He had not succeeded because he was the best technician. He had succeeded because he learned to communicate, to adapt, and to persist in uncertain environments. These qualities, he believed, would matter even more in the future. Through foundations and public initiatives, he supported teachers and students, particularly in underserved regions. His approach remained consistent with his earlier philosophy: focus on people before systems. At the same time, Alibaba continued to operate independently, guided by leadership that Jack Ma had helped cultivate. The company faced its own challenges: market fluctuations, regulatory scrutiny, and evolving consumer behavior. From a distance, Jack Ma observed rather than directed. This distance became more pronounced as regulatory environments tightened, particularly around technology companies with significant influence. Governments around the world were reassessing the role of large platforms, questioning their impact on competition, data privacy, and financial stability. In this climate, public figures associated with major technology firms found themselves under heightened attention. Jack Ma's past openness, once seen as refreshing, became more complicated. Statements that had previously been interpreted as philosophical reflections were now examined through political and regulatory lenses. The environment had changed. Adaptation, once again, was required. Jack Ma responded by becoming more reserved. Public appearances became less frequent. Interviews were limited. The shift was noticeable, and it sparked speculation. But speculation often fills the space left by silence. What remained consistent was his underlying approach to uncertainty. Rather than resisting change, he adjusted to it. He recognized that influence carries responsibilities beyond intention, and that restraint can be a form of leadership. This period highlighted a dimension of success that is often overlooked: knowing when to speak and when not to. For someone whose rise had been fueled by communication and persuasion, learning to step back was itself a form of growth. It also revealed the limits of individual control. No matter how adaptable one becomes, there are forces that operate beyond personal influence. Economic systems, political environments, and societal expectations evolve independently. Navigating them requires humility. Jack Ma had encountered rejection early in life, but this phase presented a different kind of challenge, one shaped not by lack of opportunity, but by abundance of attention. The skills required were different. Patience replaced persistence. Observation replaced action. Listening replaced speaking. In many ways, this shift mirrored the early days of his life, when learning happened quietly, without recognition. The difference now was scale. The stakes were higher, and the consequences more visible. Yet the internal process remained familiar. Jack Ma continued to emphasize long-term thinking. He spoke, when he did speak, about sustainability, not just environmental, but social and institutional. He warned against short-termism, urging organizations to consider their impact over decades, rather than quarters. This perspective, shaped by years of building rather than inheriting, remained consistent. He had learned that systems built too quickly often fracture under pressure, that trust, once broken, is difficult to restore, that progress requires balance. As public attention fluctuated, Jack Ma's personal priorities appeared increasingly aligned with reflection rather than expansion. He traveled. He studied. He engaged in conversations outside the spotlight. These activities did not signal retreat, but recalibration. For someone whose life had been defined by forward motion, this pause was not inactivity. It was adjustment, an acknowledgement that different phases require different forms of engagement. Jack Ma's story, viewed from this angle, challenges common narratives about success. It suggests that achievement is not a single state, but a sequence of adaptations. Each stage demands new skills. Each transition tests identity, from a child struggling in school, to a teacher with limited prospects, to an entrepreneur building trust in uncharted territory, to a global figure navigating complexity. The constant was not control, but responsiveness. As he moved further from the center of corporate life, Jack Ma embodied a quieter form of influence, one not measured by titles or headlines, but by the capacity to let go. This ability to release roles, expectations, and visibility is rarely discussed, yet it may be one of the most difficult transitions in any long journey, and it set the stage for the final understanding of what it truly means to rise from nothing. Jack Ma, Rise from Nothing, Full Biography, Part 5 of 5 Final. When people look at Jack Ma's life from a distance, they often see only contrast. They see poverty and wealth, failure and success, rejection and influence. But these contrasts can be misleading, because Jack Ma's journey was not defined by sudden reversals. It was shaped by continuity, a steady pattern of responding to circumstances without being consumed by them. From the beginning, his life unfolded without guarantees. As a child, there was no indication that effort would lead to reward. Academic systems did not favor him. Institutions did not select him. Employers did not recognize potential in him. Each stage presented obstacles that could have justified resignation. But resignation was never his response, not because he was fearless, but because he remained engaged. He continued learning when learning had no visible outcome. He continued applying when rejection was routine. He continued imagining possibilities when evidence was scarce. This engagement did not come from confidence in success. It came from acceptance of uncertainty. Jack Ma did not wait for clarity before acting. He acted within ambiguity. This trait followed him into entrepreneurship. When he encountered the internet for the first time, he did not see a clear business model. He saw absence, a gap where representation should be. Rather than dismissing it as impractical, he treated it as an invitation to explore. Alibaba was born not from mastery, but from curiosity. It grew not from speed, but from patience. And it endured not because it avoided challenges, but because it learned to adapt to them. As the company expanded, Jack Ma's influence became increasingly symbolic. He was no longer just a founder or a CEO. He represented a narrative, one that resonated with people who felt excluded by traditional measures of success. But symbolism is fragile. It invites projection. It attracts interpretation. It amplifies expectations. Jack Ma navigated this space imperfectly, as all public figures do. He spoke candidly, sometimes too openly for environments that reward caution. He learned again that context shapes meaning, and that scale changes consequences. His response, over time, was not defiance, but adjustment. He reduced visibility. He shifted focus. He stepped away from roles that no longer aligned with his priorities. This transition was not an admission of defeat. It was an acknowledgement of change. Many narratives frame success as accumulation, more power, more recognition, more control. Jack Ma's later choices suggest a different interpretation, that growth can also mean subtraction, letting go of positions, letting go of visibility, letting go of the need to be central. This ability to release what once defined him reveals a deeper consistency in his character. He never built his identity around titles or outcomes. From the beginning, he defined himself through engagement, with language, with people, with ideas. That engagement did not require a spotlight. In returning to education and mentorship, Jack Ma closed a quiet circle. Teaching had been his foundation. Communication had been his early strength. The same qualities that sustained him through rejection now guided him through reflection. He spoke about preparing younger generations not to follow his path, but to find their own. He emphasized adaptability over certainty, curiosity over control, resilience over perfection. These themes echo throughout his life, not as slogans, but as patterns. Jack Ma did not rise because he was exceptional at predicting the future. He rose because he remained responsive to the present. When systems excluded him, he learned outside them. When institutions rejected him, he tried again. When environments changed, he adjusted. This responsiveness, steady, patient, and human, is what carried him forward. The phrase "rise from nothing" often implies a destination, but in Jack Ma's case, it describes a process of staying engaged when progress is unclear, of continuing without assurance, of learning in the absence of validation. His life illustrates that influence does not always begin with advantage. It begins with participation. Not everyone who persists will achieve global recognition. Not every effort will be rewarded. Jack Ma's story does not promise outcomes. What it offers is a perspective that beginnings do not dictate endings, that failure is not final, that adaptation is a form of intelligence. Jack Ma did not escape difficulty. He moved through it, and in doing so, he reshaped not only his own path, but the possibilities available to others who began as he did, with very little. This is not a story of inevitability. It is a story of engagement, a reminder that influence can grow from modest origins when curiosity remains alive, when effort continues without certainty, and when identity is not bound to early limitations. That is what it meant for Jack Ma to rise from nothing. Visit for more same videos at Rise from Nothing YouTube channel.